She had stopped waiting for his voice years ago, yet when it finally came, it felt like the sound of old wood, cracking in winter. Familiar, fragile, impossible to ignore. The phone trembled in her hand as memories she'd buried began to stir. The slammed doors, the long drives to nowhere, the silence that lasted longer than forgiveness. The city around her kept moving, but her world froze between two words. He's dying. She wanted to hang up, to keep her distance, but guilt has its own gravity. Sometimes it pulls you home, even when you swore you'd never return. The voice on the other end kept talking, but she barely heard it. Somewhere in that space between past and present, one question echoed through her chest. How many miles does regret travel before it finds home? The train moved like time refusing to stop for her grief. Outside, the landscape blurred between city lights and open fields, every mile peeling back another layer of memory she didn't want to see. She tried to focus on the motion, the rhythm, the distance, but her mind kept circling back to one image, his hands steady yet shaking, always building, fixing, controlling. She wondered if he'd held her the same way, too tightly, afraid she'd break or disappear. The night pressed against the window, and for a moment, she could almost see her reflection merge with his shadow. Maybe returning wasn't forgiveness. Maybe it was the only way to stop running. She arrived before dawn, the town still asleep under a quilt of fog. Every step toward that house felt heavier than the last, like walking into a memory she'd sworn was buried. The air smelled the same, rain-soaked dirt, rusted metal, wild grass. The porch light flickered weakly, a tired eye refusing to close. For a moment, she stood there, her hand hovering over the doorknob, hearing echoes of old arguments behind the silence. She wasn't ready to face him. Maybe she never would be. But she turned the knob anyway, because sometimes courage doesn't roar, it just exhales and steps inside. Inside, the house was smaller than she remembered. Dust carried the scent of years, and silence filled the rooms where voices once collided. A framed photo hung crooked on the wall, her father holding her as a baby, smiling like a man who hadn't yet learned to raise walls instead of children. She wanted to hate that smile. She wanted to erase it, but all she could do was stare at it and wonder when love had turned into a rule book. In the kitchen, she heard soft footsteps, her mother, cautious as always, walking like she might startle the past back to life. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The quiet between them said enough. Apology, hesitation, the ache of two women who loved the same man differently. Her mother's voice was soft when she spoke his name, softer still when she said he didn't have much time. Clara nodded, eyes fixed on the narrow hallway leading to his room. The air felt heavier there, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She wasn't ready to see him, not yet. But the clock on the wall kept ticking, patient and cruel, reminding her that time waits for no reconciliation. She stood outside his room, her pulse a drum beneath her ribs. The door was half open, but the years between them made it feel locked. Every breath carried the scent of antiseptic and wood polish, a strange mix of hospital and home. She imagined him inside, the man who once shouted to be obeyed, now reduced to silence. She thought about leaving, just turning around and pretending she never came. But footsteps in the hall, her mother's whisper, her brother's quiet gaze. They all held her there. Sometimes the hardest thing is not what's behind the door, but the moment before you open it. The room smelled of medicine and dust. Machines hummed softly, filling the silence that used to belong to his voice. She expected anger to rise, but what came instead was pity and confusion. The man on the bed didn't look like the one she ran from. His shoulders had caved inward, his hands trembled slightly, and his breath was a shallow rhythm. He opened his eyes just enough to see her, and something unspoken passed between them. Not recognition, but memory, like they were both staring at a photograph they couldn't place. He tried to speak, but the words came out dry and broken, the way old wood splinters under weight. She wanted to look away, to preserve the image of him as the immovable man who ruled her childhood. But something inside her cracked instead. The realization that power fades faster than memory. His lips moved again, barely shaping her name. She couldn't bring herself to answer. Maybe it was easier to stay silent than to admit she still cared. Ethan entered quietly, carrying a bowl of soup he knew their father wouldn't eat. He placed it down, looking between them, unsure whose silence hurt more. Clara glanced up, surprised by the gentleness in her brother's eyes. He'd stayed behind all these years, shouldering the farm, the temper, the weight of their father's stubborn pride. She wondered what that had cost him, and what it said about her that she'd chosen freedom instead. Maybe both of them were just trying to survive different kinds of prisons. Mo, mighty me were, tradition since you old I. Choppy. That night, Clara sat on the porch where she'd once shouted her last words to him. The boards creaked beneath her, same as they did when she was 17 and running away. The stars hung heavy and indifferent, watching her wrestle with the same anger she thought she'd buried. Inside, she could hear her father coughing, fragile, human, breakable. For the first time, she wondered if control had been his way of saying he was afraid to lose her. The thought stung more than any memory. Forgiveness still felt impossible, but understanding, that was beginning to whisper. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house sounded like his voice echoing from years ago, sharp, certain, unbending. She remembered the arguments that began with simple things. Curfews, friends, dreams too big for the town they lived in. But under every word was fear. He never said he was afraid. He just built fences out of rules. Maybe that was his language, protection disguised as power. As she lay there listening to the quiet, she wondered how many times love had hidden itself behind control and called it safety. Morning arrived slow and gray, like the house itself was reluctant to wake. She found an old tin box tucked under her bed, one she hadn't touched since she was a teenager. Inside were pieces of another life. A postcard from a college she never went to, a concert ticket he wouldn't let her attend, a folded letter she'd never mailed. The paper trembled in her hands. Her handwriting looked younger, freer, untouched by guilt. For a moment she let herself read it, every line a reminder of who she was before she learned to be afraid of disappointing him. Later, while walking past the barn, she remembered the day everything broke. She'd been 17, standing in the rain, shouting that she couldn't breathe under his rules. He'd yelled back that she was throwing her life away. But now, as the memory unfolded, she saw something new. The tremor in his hands, the way his voice cracked when he told her she wasn't ready for the world. Maybe that wasn't anger. Maybe it was fear wearing anger's mask, the kind of fear only a man who's already lost too much can feel. She found her mother in the kitchen washing dishes that didn't need cleaning. When Clara asked why he'd been so hard on her, her mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she dried her hands and said quietly, he lost his brother when they were kids. He was supposed to be watching him. The words struck harder than any memory. All those years of control, every locked door and curfew. Maybe they were his way of keeping what he still had from disappearing again. Clara felt something shift inside her. Anger turned to ache. That evening, she walked through the barn again. Dust floated in the fading sunlight like quiet ghosts. She touched the old tools, the rope he used to teach her to tie knots, the marks on the wall where they measured her height. For the first time, she saw it. Not the cage she'd escaped, but the sanctuary he'd tried to build. Imperfect, yes, but full of effort. The anger that once burned like wildfire softened into a steady, painful warmth. Maybe love wasn't always kind. Maybe it was just a clumsy attempt to hold on before everything slipped away. The day broke heavy with heat and silence. Clara sat by the window, the morning light stretching long across the wooden floor. She heard his coughing from the next room, rough, uneven, but alive. Something in her refused to stay distant any longer. She stood, drawn by a force she couldn't name. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was love's last demand. As she walked down the hallway, her hands shook the way they had years ago when she'd left. Every step echoed the same question she'd never asked. Why wasn't I ever enough as I was? She stood at his bedside, the years between them collapsing into this fragile moment. His voice was barely more than a whisper when he said her name. It was the same voice that once commanded, now pleading. She wanted to turn away, but her heart betrayed her. It leaned closer. He told her he had done what he thought was right, that keeping her close meant keeping her safe. But she heard something else beneath it. Fear. It wasn't control had wanted. It was protection, clumsily built out of his own brokenness. And yet, the hurt didn't vanish. It just found a new name. When he reached for her hand, she pulled away. The room seemed to tilt with that motion. Words spilled out before she could stop them. Years of anger condensed into a single breath. She told him how his control had suffocated her, how she'd stopped believing she was worthy of trust or love. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. She said she'd left to save herself. He didn't argue, he just stared, eyes glistening, the weight of what he'd done finally settling into his bones. When she finished, silence filled the room, the kind that only truth can leave behind. He whispered her name again, this time like an apology. His breathing faltered, and for a moment she saw the boy her mother had described, the one who once lost his brother. The one who'd carried that guilt his whole life. I only knew how to hold on, he said, voice thin as paper. I didn't know how to let go. The words cracked her open. All the years of resentment wavered under the weight of his honesty. She wanted to hate him, but love, stubborn, aching love, refused to die. It just changed shape. His coughing deepened, the sound breaking the air like glass. She moved closer instinctively, gripping his hand before she even realized it. His skin was cold, but his grip was steady, strong. The same hands that once built fences and fixed roofs now clinging to her like an anchor. His eyes searched hers, desperate to finish a thought his lungs could. She told him to rest, voice trembling, but he kept looking, trying to say something through the failing rhythm of his breath. And in that silence, she heard it anyway. The unspoken "I'm sorry." The morning was still when she woke, too still. The sound of his coughing was gone. For a second, she thought the worst had already come, but then she heard a faint rustle, a weak breath. She rose from the chair beside his bed, unsure if she should speak. The walls seemed to hold their breath with her. When he opened his eyes, she saw the boy again. The one who carried everyone's weight, but never his own peace. There were no walls left between them now, just air, fragile and trembling. She reached for his hand, afraid it might be the last time. He asked if the house still smelled the same. She laughed softly, surprised by the question. He smiled, the faintest curve of lips, and said he'd always hoped she'd come back. Not to forgive him, but to see that he'd tried. She wanted to tell him that trying wasn't enough, but the words tangled with the lump in her throat. He spoke slowly, as if each word was a weight he had to lift. He said he'd never learned gentleness because no one had ever shown it to him. His voice cracked. "You were my lesson," he whispered. He tried to keep talking, but each breath came harder than the last. She told him to stop, to rest, to save his strength. He shook his head gently. There was something he needed to say. His hand searched for hers and found it trembling but certain. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. I only held too tight because I didn't know how to hold gently. The words hung between them like glass, sharp, fragile, final. She felt something inside her break open, not from pain, but from truth. His eyes began to lose their focus, drifting somewhere she couldn't follow. She told him she forgave him, though she wasn't sure if the words were entirely true. He smiled faintly, a soundless sigh slipping from his lips, and then he was gone. Not with a gasp or a struggle, but with the smallest exhale, as if finally setting down the burden he'd carried all his life. Clara didn't cry at first. She just sat there, her fingers still wrapped around his. For once, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. When her brother entered, he didn't say anything. He just knelt beside her, resting his hand on her shoulder. Their mother stood at the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, eyes closed. The air was thick with love and loss, bound together in the same breath. Clara finally let the tears come, slow, silent, unstoppable. For the first time, she didn't feel like a child running from something. She felt like a daughter standing still, holding what was left of a life she finally understood. In that stillness, forgiveness became real. The house felt hollow without his breath. Every clock ticked louder. Every floorboard groaned like memory itself. She wandered through the rooms as if searching for something he might have left behind. A sign, a sound, a reason. Grief has a strange way of making you tidy what's already broken. She picked up his shirt from the chair, folded it neatly, and placed it on the bed. Beneath it, her fingers brushed against something. An envelope, creased and yellowed, her name written in his unsteady hand. Her heart stilled. She didn't open it right away. Sometimes you need silence before the truth. She sat by the window, the letter unopened on her lap. Outside, the fields shimmered in the afternoon haze. The same fields he once made her help harvest. The same ones she swore she'd never see again. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if carrying every word he never dared speak aloud. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, the ink was faded, the writing uneven. The first line read simply, "If you're reading this, I didn't get to say it right." Her breath caught. The voice she thought she'd lost had found its way back through ink and regret. The letter told a story she'd never heard. He wrote about his own father, a man who shouted more than he spoke, who left more scars than lessons. He wrote about the promise he'd made as a boy, that his children would never feel unsafe. I didn't know safety could feel like a cage, the letter read. She pressed the page to her chest, eyes flooding. For the first time, she saw him not as a tyrant, but as a frightened man trying to unlearn the only love he'd been taught. Love can wound when it forgets how to breathe. She found her mother in the kitchen and handed her the letter. They read it together, quietly, the air thick with understanding. Her mother's eyes softened with a sadness that looked almost like relief. "He never stopped trying," she whispered. Clara nodded, the edges of forgiveness no longer sharp. Sometimes, love isn't loud or perfect. It's flawed, stubborn, human. In that kitchen, surrounded by ghosts and the smell of old coffee, they let silence do what words couldn't. It stitched something back together. That night, she stood at the edge of the field, the letter folded neatly in her hand. The stars were brighter than she remembered. The farmhouse behind her glowed softly, her family inside, quiet, mending, alive. She whispered his words into the air, letting them drift with the wind. I only held too tight. The rest of the sentence she finished herself. Because I loved you too much to let go. The paper fluttered once, twice, then slipped from her fingers. As it landed in the grass, She finally felt free. Morning came soft and golden, spilling over the fields like forgiveness itself. The air smelled of earth and sunlight, the kind of scent that only comes after rain and grief. Clara stepped onto the porch barefoot, feeling the rough wood beneath her feet. The same boards she once ran across in anger. The house no longer felt heavy. It simply felt human. She realized she didn't have to forget to move forward. She just had to remember differently. Some memories bruise, others heal. And sometimes they do both. Inside, her mother and brother moved gently through the day, washing dishes, sorting tools, folding the last of his clothes. There was a quiet rhythm to their movements, like the house was learning to breathe again. Clara joined them, not out of duty, but because it felt right. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It had changed shape, from punishment to peace. Sometimes love isn't what you say, it's what you keep doing when the noise is gone. Later, she walked to the edge of the property where the earth was soft and dark. She carried a small sapling, something new to root where so much had been lost. She dug slowly, steady, her palms stained with soil. Each handful felt like releasing another piece of anger. When she finally pressed the roots into the ground, she whispered a promise, not to him, but to herself. To grow without running, to remember without pain, to love without fear. As the sun dipped low, she sat beneath the new tree, watching the horizon blush with fading gold. In that quiet, she could almost hear his voice. Not the one that ordered, but the one that lingered in the lap. It didn't hurt anymore. It just existed. Maybe love doesn't disappear when someone does. Maybe it just changes form, like light through a window. Still there, only softer. She smiled, realizing forgiveness wasn't a finish line. It was the way home. Night settled slow, wrapping the house in quiet blue. She stood on the porch again, one hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the hum of crickets and the soft laughter of her family inside. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was visiting. She felt like she belonged. The stars shimmered above her, countless and patient. She looked toward the tree in the distance, its silhouette swaying in the moonlight. "We're okay now," she whispered, and though no one answered, the night itself seemed to nod.